Some people might ask, if you're transgender, then why don't you, make more videos about it? Well, there's a very simple reason for this. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to discuss the complex and very different experiences that a trans man experiences than a trans woman does. To be clear, to recognize that trans experience is not a monolith is not to erase any particular way of understanding or experiencing transgender experience. However, there is a very serious problem within modern online transgender discourse that seems to intentionally exclude the trans man. For example, while I don't really care much for the amazing digital circus, it was hard not to hear about Jax's reveal as transgender. This is nice and all, but it gets a little bit more difficult to care about when you consider the fact that Jax was literally an asshole to everyone the whole time. Even I could tell in my brief watching that Jax was a piece of shit, and it's part of the reason why I didn't really stick with the show. It is pretty difficult when you watch people who you thought were your friends asserting to you that this kind of shit is actually completely okay. It's totally okay that Jax was bullying somebody who was coded as being female from birth, from what I understand, the entire show, because she's actually transgender, and that's why she was a bully. Of course, not being able to voice my opinion on this, especially as somebody who doesn't really care about the show, people, you gotta understand, people are gonna talk about your show even if they don't watch it, because you're talking about it all the time, alright? I'm just saying. Anyways, it was extremely frustrating, but perhaps even more concerning is the normalization of transgender women bullying people assigned female at birth as a projection stage of understanding one's gender identity. This video is not about analyzing the depths of the flaws in writing Jax this way, but I think it presents an excellent example of this exact pressure that we constantly have to tolerate from trans women. And just like the writing in the show, many trans women seem to believe it goes all away once she discovers her transgender identity. Commonly, when these complaints are brought up, issues regarding the bodies of trans men, when we discuss the relationship with uteruses or other female sex organs, and how they relate to our transgender experience and how those positioned differently across the transgender spectrum experience it differently, are systematically dismissed on our so-called bioessentialism, on the grounds that discussing a part of our bodies is somehow turf talking points. I'm gonna be real with you. With such an opinion, one has to really ask how fucking stupid people actually think trans men are. You're literally saying that we are supporting a movement that will literally shoot ourselves in the face. Why would you assume that? Why would you assume we're just fucking stupid? Oh, I'll get into that later. You're just assuming that we're going to support a movement that not only tries to take away access to transgender recognition, healthcare, and open transition, but also psychologically abuses trans men on the regular by targeting their relationship to their body that too often many trans women just seem to have a problem with. For example, what purpose may a transgender man have brought up the term male socialization? This is a criticism that I see from trans women criticizing trans circles. So this isn't about TERFs. It is almost certainly about trans men. So what purpose would a trans man have to say such a thing? Again, the trans man has no interest in taking away your hormones. Instead, he's trying to draw emphasis to misogyny that is, he has to tolerate from you or other trans women or other trans femmes' behavior. He is trying to say, stop acting like a man. But he doesn't want to hurt your feelings because he knows you are not a man. He just wants you to stop asserting the power that you were assigned at birth against him. This is a subtle, delicate, and difficult to discuss problem because it seems to toy with the very idea of what transgender identity is. How can a woman act like a man anyway? And if I were socialized male, then can I ever be a woman? But as a trans man, it is impossible to ignore that many of these counterclaims actually prove very clearly someone was forcibly positioned in a so-called male space at the beginning of their life. Simply being able to go into the men's room without being threatened is a demonstration of this positioning. Seriously, if you did this when you were 5 years old and you weren't told to go to the women's room, people saw you as a man. There's consequences to that. If you think being approached by a transphobic cis woman is scary, imagine what it feels like to be 5'6", approached by a man, ogling your breasts in the restroom, and pushing you into a corner. I know what that feels like. They're still gonna call the cops on you afterwards, okay? But I've literally been cornered by a fucking straight man in the bathroom before because of this shit. Nobody gets to talk about that, though. And it is painful and scary to admit, but sometimes this residual factor still exists, just as I have many residual factors of being a woman. And to be clear, there's plenty of misogynistic cis women. I mean, look at the fucking cottagecore industry. In fact, I would argue that a completely different function is happening here, and it only makes sense if we try to understand being transmasculine from a transmasculine point of view. For example, it is genuinely shocking how readily trans women are ready to dismiss the 22 years of my life that I lived as a woman. I will openly state, I lived 22 years of my life as a woman, and now I live as a man. And yet, I will be denied access to this status. Instead, I was male-brained, socially male even. You know, the same thing that you get mad at being called at. You know, or whatever nonsense people will readily peddle. Some will go as far as to assert that I could have never possibly been a woman. This not only comes with the erasure of my past, but also the traumas encoded in it. I am somehow supposed to process the years of misogyny and sexual abuse as male, despite not experiencing them that way. It seems very apparent to me that the core difference in the transmasculine condition is that to me, and probably many other trans men, the possibility of escaping our past as women is not really possible. It isn't really a matter of socially encoded roles or structures in our bodies, but rather the nature of womanhood and misogyny itself. After all, intersex and infertile women assigned female at birth still have to deal with many of these issues. In fact, it isn't that trans men are trying to erase a trans woman relationship with her own understanding of trauma or her womanhood, but rather to encourage her to try to understand transmasculinity's relationship to it. After all, we can deconstruct many of the previous statements here presented against trans men as explicitly misogynistic by simply recognizing the reality that many trans men consider themselves more a woman who has transitioned to a man rather than a man at birth. That desire may have existed to be a man from an early age, but a trans man wasn't just a man at birth. He had to discover his desire and found himself within a misogynistic prison. In fact, the story is quite similar to feminists who fought for reproductive freedom over their uterus. A big aspect of feminism is delinking the misogynistic function of various parts of the body. Any woman will tell you that when growing up, you are told that you're supposed to have sex or make babies because that's what your body is supposed to do. This is a reinforcement of misogynistic body norms that try to force the assigned female to codify themselves within the context of feminine fertility. She must have children, she must have a family. This is so constant and oppressive that families, doctors, community members, and sometimes even complete fucking strangers will get on her case about her biological clock, or that some women with fertility issues have serious self-image issues relating to their inability to conceive. If this is the case, that trans men are actually women who decided to be men, then telling a trans man that he is not a woman when he clearly tells you such is nothing short of pure misogyny. Telling a trans man to his face that he did not live his life as a woman, suggesting to your friends that trans men made the wrong choice, that testosterone is some kind of demon drug or whatever fucking nonsense, all now sounds quite eerily similar to telling a woman what to do with her body or her words, doesn't it? Complaining that trans men have nothing to complain about, that they don't have real issues, that they are just making shit up when they experience misogyny, mimics almost entirely the exact same misogynistic undercutting that cis women have to tolerate constantly. This behavior is what reinforces the existence of gender binary so readily within these trans circles, because so many trans people seem to believe that becoming a trans man means relinquishing all possible womanhood. Indeed, it is far more acceptable to tell a trans man that he will never be capable of looking good in a dress than a trans woman. The issue is quite simple. Most trans men are just not men. They are women who became men. They are men now, but in the past they experienced womanhood. And even then, some trans men are not much of men at all. Me, I simply like to wear male signifiers like a bagworm. So these misogynistic discourses concentrate their pain in my sides even more. In fact, trans men are feminists so radical with their bodies that they decided to escape the very code of being women themselves. They were not satisfied with the answers that came with second-wave feminism could offer because it didn't allow them to be a man. A cis woman, after all, can't be a gay man. That was my very predicament. Bringing this conversation back to the problem of TERFs, quite to the contrary of what trans women believe, and partly because of so many of their desire to misogynistically dismiss our issues, TERFs actually target trans men very aggressively. This may seem odd, considering how vile they treat trans women, but the way that trans men are targeted is particularly insidious. Have you ever asked yourself, for example, why so many who detransition for reasons outside of safety, people who make a public fuss about how they made the wrong choice, are usually trans men? There's a reason for that. Cis women know this phenomenon quite intimately, and trans women find out through a rude awakening. At all times, at every angle, a woman who asserts herself in any way finds herself shoved back into the cage of being a woman. Not just any woman either, but the domesticated woman. Domestication here is a double entendre, of course. I refer to the domesticated housewife who stays at home, but I also refer to the domestication of livestock. What purpose does a woman have to stay at home for, mandated by the state and asserted by violent men, other than to be reduced to the livestock whose body is to serve the reproduction of the human race? It is not simply just a desire to detransition, it is a desire to uphold the structure of the patriarchy, because misogyny is not a moral act. Individual acts of misogyny are a consequence of much larger structures that only coalesce in certain ways due to the position that one lies on this massive machine. Consistently, cis women are pressured back into the role of a reproductive submissive for her husband. Now consider what TERFs actually see trans men as. They do not see them as men. They see them as confused women. If you pay attention, trans men are targeted on every fiber of existence that they struggle through alone, in ways that most trans women show no interest in or support for beyond performative allyship. At least my girlfriend cares. I love you. The systematic process of telling women who became men to shut up and sit down has led to a massive vulnerability within the trans-masculine population. The same phenomenon that produces the cottagecore industry is the same one that produces the TERF mindset that intends to put the trans man back in his place of being a woman who loves herself. But this is where things get interesting. If you might notice, the TERF is quite literally telling a woman what to do with her body. TERFs and reactionary trans women seem to agree on one thing, that trans men are clearly too stupid to understand themselves and they can't reliably make their own decisions because they should have been women this whole time. With these points exposed in the open for what they are, it exposes quite clearly and obviously just how misogynistic this perspective actually is. TERFs only have interest in controlling the bodies of women. All women. Instead of being a traitor, the trans man who detransitions is a symptom of a greater, invisible, and dangerous misogyny that is still ignored, that threatens all trans people and gender minorities. Thus, this raises a fascinating point. By analyzing the trans man as a transitional species, one that was definitely not born this way, but rather the product of progressive developments and changes in position, we realize something fundamental about the nature of transphobia and misogyny. Both are about controlling the actions of women, whether they be trans women, cis women, or women who became men, or any other kind of woman. Not only does it try to control material women, it tries to control every manifestation of women. It tries to control the very subject of what women are. Suddenly, misogyny is no longer a problem that exists on the individual scale of how we treat men or women, but rather a function of asserting the patriarchy, a slave machine designed to attempt to domesticate the reproductive units of human society through violence and rape. Everyone is involved in this equation. It is not a question of who has more or less sin, but rather one of forming new relations to our bodies, a process that aims to liberate humanity as a whole from the confines of patriarchy.